Hello, this is To Be Read, in which we interview authors about their books on Brazilian themes. Today we are going to talk about religion, politics, and geopolitics with international reporter Adriana Carranca. She is the author of books on Afghanistan and Iran, among others, and recently published Soul by Soul by Columbia Global Reports. In this new work, she tells the story of an evangelical missionary family that moved from Brazil to Afghanistan a few years after the US invasion in 2001 to spread the gospel to Muslims. From 2012 to 2022, she followed their life and traveled with them to 12 countries. The pilgrimage of a couple and their two small children reveals a larger phenomenon which involves the colossal mobilization from the US to proclaim Christianity around the world, as well as the strength of neo-Pentecostalism in Brazil, where evangelicals have become an important group of the electorate. The book brings the panorama with impressive numbers. Pentecostalism evolved from a small group in California in the beginning of the 20th century to a worldwide movement with an estimated 300 million followers nowadays. That makes it the fastest growing religious sect in history. And Latin American countries, and Brazil specifically, stand out in this process. By 2040, more Protestants will live in Brazil than in the United States, for example. Furthermore, while Americans still dispatch more missionaries than any other country, Brazil has become the second largest country to do so. By 2021, the Global South had deployed more than 200,000 foreign missionaries, almost half of the world's total. In the 1970s, this figure didn't reach 15%, Adriana Carranca highlights. And she's here to help us understand all of this better. Welcome, Adriana. It's a great pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here.
So, to start, Adriana, tell us a little about your characters, please. Who are these believers who leave Brazil to convert people in the Middle East? What reality do they leave behind here?
So I was as surprised as you when I first met them. I was in Afghanistan covering the war, and there was this Brazilian humanitarian agent who worked for the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. And I asked her, but without not really any hope, if she knew other Brazilians in Afghanistan. At that time, Afghanistan had Brazil had no embassy in Afghanistan, no commercial relations whatsoever. So, there was not really a particular reason for Brazilians to go to Afghanistan, except if as an employee of one of the aid organizations there, or the government, or it's what you had at the time in Afghanistan. And she said, well, there is this couple who runs a pizza delivery business here. And I said, no, they don't. It's hard to believe that, a Brazilian, middle-class, educated Brazilian with two small children would move to Afghanistan to run a pizza delivery business in a war-torn country. And so I was very suspicious. I thought they were either, mercenaries or drug dealers. Afghanistan is the largest opium exporter in the world. And so I thought there was something there, and I ordered pizza. And that's how my journey began.